All right, welcome everybody. Just before we get started on today's agenda for the working group meeting, I wanted to call out this still in review section at the top. It's getting a bit longer than it's been in the past. So if you own one of the documents up there and it is no longer in need of a review, if you would be so kind as to remove it from the list. If on the other hand, you own the document up there and you still are in need of a review, I would recommend potentially putting that on an agenda for a future meeting to help bring attention to it. Some of the documents up there I'm familiar with, and I think I know what they're waiting for. A few others, as I look down the list, I'm not entirely sure what we're waiting on, or if it just needs, perhaps we're waiting on me. So one way or the other, if we could just do a little bit of cleaning of that list over the next week, I think that would be very helpful. And with that, I think Niranjan is at the top of the list for the agenda.
Hey, Mitch. Yeah, thanks. I think like a few weeks back, I said I could tackle one of like the open issues for adding like multi-cluster Helm installation steps. So for like the different models, primary, remote, multi-primary, and like the different network topologies. While I was sort of testing that stuff out, I realized the Istio remote chart doesn't get published anywhere. It's on the GitHub repo, but I don't think it's actually part of the like the default artifact registry or the Helm repository where the other charts are. If you try just running like Helm install Istio Istio-d/remote, I don't think it would actually like get installed, at least from what I tried. So I was wondering how to get that published, because I don't think, because like to test it out, I pushed it to one of our test like OCI Helm repositories, but to actually like write like documentation or guidance on it, I think it would be helpful to have that published beforehand. I think Keith responded with a comment on that issue about the remote chart not being available, but I wasn't sure how to get that published, like who decides which charts get published and so on.
Great, thanks. So you got the details. Does anyone know the history of why this path or why this chart is not published today?
Hello?
Hey, we hear you now, John.
Yeah, so when we published the Helm charts, we did it as part of the Helm beta, and we published only the charts that we felt were beta quality, which was kind of the core for base, gateway, Istio, and TNI, and hopefully now ztunnel. I assume we published ztunnel. Yeah, we published ztunnel, so I guess 5 now. So the remote one didn't make the list. We can debate whether it should make the list. There's definitely some that shouldn't make the list, like the legacy Ingress Gateway and Egress Gateway ones, I think. See what else is there. And the operator, that was also an intentional not published one that is actually next on the agenda list. So that does leave kind of remote as whether we do or do not include that.
I'm not familiar with the remote chart. What's different about it? Is it just Istio with different values, which is what I would naively assume?
No, it doesn't have Istio at all. It's just you have Istio in a completely remote cluster, and you just boilerplates CRDs.
Yeah, but it's like 99% similar. Like we literally, to build the chart, we copy it from the Istio chart and manipulate it. So I'm almost, I don't know. I'm wondering if it's actually makes sense, especially now that we have profiles. Like, is it just a profile? Maybe it's not, but we should do some due diligence because we want to maintain it for.
We have that base chart too, right? Which we already use to deploy a lot of CRD stuff, assorted preliminary bits. So I wonder if it could always just be moved as an optional component of that, or something like that. Yeah, I agree. We should probably.
It's a bit more complicated because of permissions. I mean, you need to grant permission. I mean, that's really the biggest problem. Why I'm not entirely sure if remote is ready. The way it works, you need to create a service account, grant it all permissions, and have some way for the kind of remote STOD to impersonate or to act like this account. And that part has always been a bit tricky, especially since we moved the RBAC from one place to another. It's not. I mean, the trick. I would agree with John that we can just remove the deployment and it's the same thing. But in reality, you want remote to be carefully curated to not grant all the permissions that a local STOD would need.
If it's a matter of service account creation, we can do something where we tell you to create the service account yourself and then point the Helm chart at it or something. If it's already there, we can figure it out. But yeah, maybe we can combine it or chip bits of it out into something else at least. I don't know.
If someone has the time to review the RBAC permissions and to make sure that they're not excessive, because that really is the problem. When you run STOD in your cluster, you grant pretty much the old permissions. When you have remote, typically you want a bit less. It's not the serious thing. It's creating the RBAC permission because they're excessive in the main chart.
So let's maybe have a tracking issue for making the remote chart usable or production ready or whether that means ditching it or absorbing it elsewhere or doing something. Don't know yet. Okay, but yeah, it sounds like we need to actually do work there.
So it sounds like we have consensus that this is a thing users should be able to do. Installing, remote control plane for multi-cluster configuration is something we ought to support from Helm as well as from Istio Cuddle, which I think today you can do it with the operator, as I understand, or the operator file in Istio Cuddle. The question really, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think what I'm hearing is the question is about implementation. Do we do that by publishing this particular chart as is, or by profiles in another chart or some other solution?
We need to do a pass on this chart to see if the current state is what we want and then publish once we're good with it.
Yeah, for what it's worth, you can install with Helm. You just have to do it by downloading the release and pointing to the local file, which is admittedly not ergonomic at all. So,
yeah,
there's probably better ways.
And there is also the issue if that's how we want users to deal with the central STOD case, because I mean, speaking for an example with what Google is doing, usually if you operate a central STOD, you probably have some automation or tooling in the central STOD cluster. I mean, first of all, you need that particular cluster to have all the permissions to all the remote cluster to watch them. So typically, you would not operate from the leaf cluster, from the client cluster. You can automate and do the install from the primary cluster. So something like we do with Gateway, where we automatically deploy. You would have some tooling that is automatically provisioning and doing all the automation as a central STOD event or whatever it is, because that really is the main use case for the central STOD was when it was designed. So it may be better to just do some micro operators, since we are deprecating the operators, so like we do for gateways, and have, since you have permissions, a remote cluster, and probably you need to patch the webhooks and other things, just have the STOD central set whatever is necessary in the remotes.
Costin, I think that's largely, the objective here, but rather than building our own operator, publishing this chart would enable us to call it from, say, Argo or Flux or other, central operator frameworks, GitOps frameworks, so that we're not rolling our own.
Good, but it's. I mean, you could argue that creating gateway deployments automatically using the gateway API is also kind of an operator. And STOD itself is an operator since it's patching all kind of resources and doing all kind of operations. The main point here is that the best user experience for a central STOD, I don't know if Google is a good example or not, but having the automations performed by the central STOD is usually what the user expects when they operate in this mode. If what you are describing is perfect if you operate your own STOD and you do as a cluster owner. But usually, you don't run Istio in your cluster because you are expecting someone remote to operate it. And then probably you should not deal with Argo for Istio because you cannot do patch. I mean, what are you going to do? You cannot touch the primary cluster.
Costin, I think like Mitch's point is like if you like you would probably still need to install the remote resources onto onto the users clusters, right? So then like you would still kind of need a way of like if the remote chart is available in Helm, you can just kind of like have like some sort of GitOps workflow that schedules the remote charts to be published directly on the users cluster. And then like, yeah, you'd still have Istio kind of hosted on the remote cluster, like the main control plane, but the remote control plane, like it would be easier to install, like if it's there as like a Helm chart or something.
I don't disagree. I mean, perhaps if we restrict this to only remote Istio that have DNS certificate, so there is no patching for the webhooks, it would be a simple chart. The main issue we have with the installation of Istio is that we have the webhook, the mutating webhook, and that requires the permission to patch the certificates from the central, and that complicates pretty much everything. And if Istio central has the permission to mess with webhooks, it can create them, because that's really what it is. I mean, it has some RBACs and you have some mutating webhooks that are created. And then the revision and all the other stuff when it changes, which is another story that probably we should discuss at some point of having a proper gateway and not how do we deal with revisions when you have central Istio, because it's a completely different experience.
Yeah, let's see. So Ben recommends opening an issue for fixing and stabilizing, and we can handle the implementation details there. I think I'm in favor of that. I might recommend Costin, like the thoughts on improving, requiring DNS with a certificate as a prerequisite for this. That's interesting, but it sort of feels unrelated. Like we're already publishing documentation on how to install a remote Istio. It's already part of Istio.io. It's part of our install guides. So it seems like we can do these in two work streams. One work stream is get our Helm chart published however it ought to be published, as a profile or as an independent chart. The other work stream being correcting or improving that DNS posture, not just for the Helm chart in particular, but for every way that we recommend installing this on Istio.io. That way we're consistent.
I'm curious, how many users what is the use case? You are a vendor, or are you trying to do it for, you just want to have fun, or what's the rationale for this?
I mean, I assume that a vendor can figure out how to download the repository and probably even has their own private repository of Helm charts that they can operate from if they see fit. The use case where this becomes a little bit more interesting is when you have companies trying to run their own platform engineering org. Oftentimes those are going to be built on Argo, Backstage, Flux, etc. And their typical way of handling adding a new cluster to their portfolio of managed clusters within the platform is going to be to install a variety of Helm charts for CNI, for service mesh, for OPA, other sort of cross-cutting concerns that they want to have across all of those environments. So I think that's really where having this published publicly will be helpful.
So the reason I ask is really simple. It's the amount of testing that went into it. I mean, the usage, the number of users, and the complexity of the Istio remote operation are probably okay for a vendor like that is providing a multi-tenant or massive, supported Istio. It's not necessarily something we want a regular user, even if they have to necessarily use, because it's far more complicated, has all kinds of implications. I mean, you are far better off using Istio just like everyone else by deploying the Istio chart and running it in each cluster and not having to deal with all those complexities. Because it's not only the chart, it's also the amount of testing, the amount of support, the amount of expertise. I don't think whatever one customer does can generalized because it's kind of so support and documentation and all the other stuff for the release mode case. It's a massive undertaking for us to move it to beta and pretend it's something anyone can use when it's mostly designed for vendors.
Louis, if you're trying to talk, we can't quite make out what you're saying. There's some audio problems there. Yeah, Kotzen, while Louis figures out his audio, I think I would not necessarily be in favor of promoting this to beta, but what's at question is not whether we should promote it or even whether we should publish and document it. This is already published and documented. It's just a matter of whether users ought to be able to follow those steps using a Helm repository that's public, or whether they ought to have to download our release first.
Can you hear me now?
Much better, Louis.
Okay. To what Costin just said, like I wonder if this is a good operational pattern for people who are doing their own platform engineering, as opposed to, let's say, hypothetically, installing an Istio in a cluster as primary, and then installing an Istio in a bunch of other clusters as secondary, and pointing it at the primary. Right, and letting some of the operational complexity that's encapsulated in the Helm chart live inside Istio.
That's another option. I mean, having XDS basically just XDS serving, so it solves the multi-cluster problem by having the secrets only as a primary cluster and leaving the Istio light basically just doing the. That's a very good option. It's.
I mean, it's basically just installing an agent, right? I mean, packaging aside, I only mentioned Istio because it's just how we package stuff. But it's really just, there's a cluster remote agent that's pointing at the primary and setting things up.
At that point, why don't we have, I mean, we already have the MCP, whatever, why don't we have Istio connect to the primary cluster Istio and act also as a cache? And I mean, it's a good
path. Yeah,
that's
right. Then that choice is not a choice the user has to make, right? So then we can do whatever we want, whichever we think is the most reliable, whether it's, serve XDS directly in that Istio, have that just redirect to XDS in the other cluster, have a failover mode, right, where if the primary cluster goes out, that thing continues to serve for the local cluster, right? Like one of the big problems with multi-primary is if the primary goes down.
Keith?
I think what I'm hearing is can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I stopped seeing the animation on my thing and got worried. I think what I'm hearing is a desire to be more opinionated on how users should be running Istio in a multi-cluster context. That is a worthwhile conversation. I don't know if that's the conversation that we're wanting at this issue is kind of setting up. Under the current documentation, we offer and advertise a primary remote mode, primary remote mode. We should enable users to accomplish that mode in a production-ready way. That's kind of my perspective here. Digging into the merits a bit, I'm a little concerned about the idea of essentially forcing multi-primary unless we have a really strong reason to do so, namely existing usage of customers utilizing Istio in that way. And on top of that, one of the reasons why you would use a remote instance is so that each one of your clusters doesn't have to allocate resources for an Istio. I don't know that that's our decision or that customers would want that to be our decision to pick the right architecture. I understand wanting to limit choices and make things simpler for users, but I'm I'm generally a -1, I think, and for well, I won't go that far. I just think it's when it comes to the Istio remote chart, I think there are two open questions that I'm hearing. One is or two open concerns rather. One is that the Istio remote chart is not production ready. Okay, we can decide whether to either make it production ready or collapse it into something else that is, or some other chart. That is one option. The other option is, or the other thing that I'm hearing as a concern is maybe we want to be more opinionated on how customers to Istio multi-cluster. And that I think is probably a bigger conversation.
Austin?
So multi-cluster is a separate discussion. I don't want to mix how we do multi-cluster into this particular issue. The real problem is how many things. I mean, we always from the beginning of we spread too thin. I mean, we have too many options. We had 3 operators installed Istio cattle plots, 3 Helm charts. That it's too much for anyone to understand, to support, and to pretend that all of them are equal, like we had with the different options. It's misleading. At least it's not necessarily honest to the users. We can, for example, I mean, like we did for operator. An operator is in the ecosystem. We could have an ecosystem project that has Istio remote chart, publish them there. And I mean, as long as we can make it clear that if you are a normal Istio user and you want the maximum stability, use Istio cattle or Helm install with the normal stuff that is tested and it has been used by 99% of the users. If you want to have fun ecosystem, at least not put the same level in the same repository with the normal ones. At some point, maybe for resources or whatever reasons, it may become very popular. And if we define that 50% of users are using Istio remote, then maybe we have another discussion. What are the 2 official or recommended ways? But we cannot pretend that everything that is documented actually works and it's equally well supported and tested.
Yeah, I totally agree that this would not change how well supported or how well tested external control plane is. It's simply taking our existing external control plane doc, which requires downloading our release, and making it so that it no longer requires downloading our release. I think overall, we as a community fall into a little bit of an engineering trap that when a topic is raised about like improving a feature in a very small way, we wind up having a larger dialogue and referendum on the entire existence and future of the feature. I think we should totally have that conversation. If there's better ways for us to run Istio remote, if this remote operator that Louis, or a remote agent rather that Louis proposed, is a better design for our users, we should absolutely have that conversation. We should get some design docs spun up. And when it's ready, we should probably replace the existing Helm chart with this new model of doing things. But for now, for Niranjan's sake, I'd like to see if we can focus the conversation on moving users from having to download the release to being able to pull it from a Helm repo. Is that acceptable to everyone, or it doesn't seem like we're exposing anything new to the users, making any new recommendations for what they should or shouldn't do?
No, that part seems fine.
Okay. But I am very much intrigued by these other ideas, like the idea of Istio-Ds collaborating together to form a multi-cluster mesh. That's I think it's worth exploring. So Niranjan, do you feel like you have what you need? I know Ben had some ideas of where some changes that you're talking about could go in the chat. Do you feel like you have what you need to move forward?
The release builder repo should be enough if you want to do a publish PR.
Awesome.
Okay. So we would add it to the release builder repo, but the point about whether that remote chart itself is production ready, or what we want to do to get it like to being promoted to beta, or whether we want to do that through the Istio remote chart or find ways of having that in the Istio like the main HDOD chart, but adding like a remote profile for Helm. I'm still like a little bit less clear on that.
Profiles are preferred for simplicity, but I think I heard John say that some of the things we're doing in that remote chart or would not be viable from a profile. Am I summarizing you right, John?
I actually was trying to say the opposite, that maybe now that we have profiles, we don't need to do the chart, but I don't think that's actually necessarily true. Like we do a bit more. I mean, it definitely could be. Like the chart is derived from the other chart. It's just a matter of whether we have two charts or we make one chart that has more complex and has more if statements. I don't know exactly how much more complex it is yet, but I'd have to look into it more.
Can I suggest that Niranjan and Ben work together to understand what's the best way to move this forward, since they both seem to have a lot of context and investment? Ben, is it okay to throw you under that bus?
Yep, I did open my mouth.
Appreciate that. Okay, Ian, I think you're up next.
Sure, thanks. So I wanted to revisit the DNS auto allocation version 2 a little bit. I think last time we talked about it was in May sometime. We came to a consensus that it probably is needed. We should work on building it, and that we prefer a controller rather than another mutating webhook. So I started working on that a little bit. Right now, it's doing some sort of kludgy stuff to store the assigned IPs. That's not great. So I wanted to see if we could get some consensus around where we're going to store addresses that are auto-allocated in the service entry. To my mind, a new field under status that's just addresses with a list of those addresses is probably preferred. We had also in the doc proposed that maybe it's an annotation. And my current kludge is that I jammed it into a condition. It's terrible, but it is there. Does anyone else have an objection to putting it under addresses?
Addresses and status, right? Not in spec.
Yes, definitely. The one consensus we did get last time was that mutating the spec was not what we wanted to do.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good. The only thing we'll want to consider is whether it's all addresses or auto-assigned addresses. Like if they already explicitly set some, do we copy them over into the status? My inclination is that we should make the field called auto-assigned addresses or something. And that in order to understand the actuated addresses, you look at both fields. It's not like you just only look at the status. But we could explore both options.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Didn't the Gateway API already establish like a pretty well-defined precedent for all of this? Because it has auto-assigned IP addresses as part of the spec.
I see some hands up. Of course, for that question, I'm looking to John and Keith.
Yes, yes, they did. I mean, they made a decision here and they implemented something similar. It would differ from what I had just said in that the source of truth for that is the status. So the spec is the intent and the status is the actual representation. I'm just wondering, for us, especially given the pre-existence of spec for a long time without status, like, is there a value in if I create a service entry at right now with the spec, with the address already set, should I really have to wait for some controller that's new to come in and go write something to status before it's usable? Just not sure that's giving us any value.
Yeah, and there would be some like weird special casing probably, because I think the controller probably won't just be on by default. And so if it's not on, nothing would copy that down, and then you just can't use the spec, which is weird and probably breaks a bunch of stuff.
Yeah,
So,
the gateway is a little different because what you're saying in the gateway spec is I want a load balancer with this address. And what you're saying in status is I created a load balancer with this address. but we're not actually creating anything with service entry.
Unless we are, right, in the auto case.
Yeah, I mean, in the auto case, yes, but
Okay.
not if they specify something explicitly.
Ian, so that I understand option 3, if we're using the service CIDR range, we're essentially doing IPAM on service CIDR to understand which addresses are already used. We're assigning an address from that range, and then we'd create a service with that address.
I think in option 3, there's a new like IP address resource, right, John? Do I understand that correctly? And so we would like need to be able to create one of those. And then
Yeah, it's alpha in 1.29 or 1.30 though, so this is not something that we could actually do for a while.
Okay. And I actually just realized I jumped the line. I'm sorry. Others have their hands up. Jeremy?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on what Ian said. I think he mentioned annotation. I just want to understand, like, how do we decide between annotation and label?
So generally what we've been doing, at least of late, is that labels would contain something that's user intent, and annotations would, I guess, in this case, contain something that should be in status, in my opinion. But Ben, I think you've been driving some of this. Sorry, Costin, go ahead.
Yeah, no, usually, you use labels if it's something that needs to be indexed, because it creates some indexing and it allows API server to do better selection and annotation for everything. And there is no real distinction. They've been used for, both of them have been used for user intent. Both of them have been used, but the main difference is that one can be indexed when you do search, when you do, API calls, the other one cannot. You need to get everything and then select. So what I wanted to say, I also worked a bit on this with external DNS. I have a patch to take service entries to propagate them to any of the 100 DNS servers supported. And I've been looking at this. I'm perfectly fine. I mean, first of all, I don't think we have necessarily consensus, maybe a majority of that we should not modify address. After all, with webhook, I think we all agree. But that doesn't mean that you cannot mutate it with any controller, because there are plenty of controllers that mutate fields in a spec. And the benefit of mutating it would be that it will work with all the old versions of Istio. So whatever we do, its status will only be valid for Istio 123. If we have a controller that mutates the address and allocate an address, that will work for any older versions that are still in cluster. And it will be, kind of not an ATI change. It will be, and there is nothing that prevents the controller to mutate a field. My main concern really is not about where we put it. It's about not putting in a place that is different from everyone else. So either we copy the pattern of service, where it's cluster IP, or we copy the pattern of gateway, and it's exactly the same field, or some pattern that is commonly used for putting the address and not something different. Because if you look at external DNS, they have 20 different resources that they support. And they usually have some patterns where, they look in specific places, and it's much easier to because everyone has, if you just take a look at external DNS sources package, and you'll find how they get IPs from, I think there are 30 or 40 different places including virtual services, routes, and plenty of other places. So just copy whatever is the most common. And my final comment is my major concern with allocation is that we allocate to everything. So even if the service entry is used for a backend, even if the service entry has a completely arbitrary HVDN, I have a PR in progress to put some limits on to allow users to declare intent that, hey, for this service entry, please leave it alone. Don't allocate anything because it's only used for a backend and it doesn't need a front-end address. Or and also to limit if it has host names that are completely arbitrary, don't allocate, don't touch, because again, it's a security problem. DNS is going to create entries for arbitrary host and IPs. I have the other document where I explain a bit what are the problems with the current blind allocate to absolutely everything, even if they don't need it, and there is no user intent for requesting allocation.
Austin, is this something that we could use DNS without being opinionated about what DNS we're using? Or would we need to
That's my
implement our
stance.
own DNS proxy or like require core DNS specifically or something along those lines?
No. External DNS has already plugins for Istio, means they can take addresses from virtual service, Istio Gateway, and 3 other places. Plus, again, many other projects, Glue, and pretty much everything that is dealing with gateway. All implementation of gateways, they have something. They pull the IP address and hostname, and they can populate in Google DNS, Cloudflare, GoDaddy, pretty much a long list. Pretty much everything that has users, they have a plugin there, and they can put it in the real DNS. And after you put it in the real DNS, of course, it's visible globally or internal because they support internal zones. And it's completely neutral and works from VMs from anywhere that any client that knows how to talk DNS will get the information. They can also put TXT entries. They can create all kinds of other fancy stuff, and then you can sign it with DNS signatures and do all kinds of advanced stuff. But it is not working unless we restrict the current model where pretty much everything gets, because it's not. You don't want everything to be populated in DNS, only things that are necessarily, you intend to use them as contents.
Thanks. John?
Yeah, Clarkson, I want to clarify because you said a lot of things that I agree with, but I also feel like the proposal meets those things that you want to happen. Do you disagree and think that doesn't, or you just are not sure and want to make sure those are met?
No. Which proposal? I mean, the proposal of using annotations or status or something, perfect. As long as I see another example of someone that is doing exactly the same thing and is not an Istio only mechanism.
Yeah, so I think what we were saying was we'll put it in status, which is exactly how Gateway works, and that we'll have a.
Status was same place. I mean, the same place. I mean, so if I have a client that is blindly looking at status and finds something.
Well, it's a different resource, so I don't know what you mean by the same place. You can't
That's
blindly look at a field and a resource you don't know about, right?
Actually, that's not true, and that's an interesting thing that they're doing. And 2 other people are doing. There's basically that. I think Knative also has a similar mechanism where they use the dynamic thing, the dynamic type, and then just look at it as a JSON and look at it in a specific place. And it's kind of a pattern interface if you think about it, where you don't necessarily need to have dependencies to all 100 clients and watch everything. Treat it as a JSON with a specific path and get the address from there without caring what it is.
I see. Do we need to do that though? I mean,
it would be nice. I mean, for users, instead of having everything Istio not invented here, for once we should take something invented elsewhere and use it. I mean, it's not. I cannot imagine
they
very
have
good reasons.
Like the Kubernetes gateway spec, for example, like you can assign a host name. It does not make any sense to assign a host name for service entry.
Why not? I mean, for HTTP, for an HTTP,
what does it mean to assign a host name for a service entry?
So if you have that's another thing. I mean, for example, for service entries that only have HTTP, perhaps you don't need to assign unique IPs. Perhaps you can assign CNAMEs that just like normal HTTP servers. The host is basically you create a CNAME, and that goes to the load balancer. And there are plenty of use cases where you assign I mean.
That's already a feature of the API, though, right? I can already do that today in service entry. Not auto allocate, right? Like you can't dynamically generate a hostname custom. I think you can manually.
You cannot. Yes, that's true. That's true.
Right. So I don't think hostname.
That would be a new feature. I agree.
Yeah, hostname would not belong in status, right? Because it's going to be part of the API, which it already isn't.
Oh, but if we copy what Gateway is doing, we gain this feature as well. That's maybe good, maybe bad. Maybe don't copy gateway. Just find someone else.
Well,
It's
I
just
guess
not invented here.
there is precedent for auto-generating host names, right? Like serverless systems tend to do it. So we should probably be careful not to rule that out, even if we don't intend to do it in the initial round.
Especially given how waypoints work and how managed, east-west gateway and a lot of other places, having a single IP and unique IP allocated sometimes can be limiting, because host naming gateway is a very powerful feature for all managed and kind of CDN based, Cloudflare and similar
Right. Yeah.
destinations.
Yeah. So there, I just think we should be careful in design not to prevent that feature down the road, but I don't think that immediately affects what is being proposed here. I don't think API machinery has ever made a positive statement about duck typing and status, which is what you're talking about, Costin, right?
No, well, others did, but so my point is, if you show me someone else doing it, I'm happy. That's all I'm asking. Is
Okay.
one other person, one other project doing it, and not something original.
All right. Well, we know Gateway is definitely doing it, so we're good there, I think.
So I guess it's an implementation detail. Maybe we just cross this bridge later, but gateway isn't just a list of like strings. There's actually like it's like a list of an address type that includes like what type of address it is and could hold a host name or an IP address, or I don't know, maybe something else. Do we want?
That doesn't sound like the worst idea.
Yeah, we could just adopt basically that type if we want to, instead of a list of strings or. John, do you have an opinion?
I don't want to add host names unless we want to add host names. Like what I don't want to do is look at an API, say they have host names, therefore we should have host names when we don't have a use case to have host names. We should figure out what use cases we have and then try and shape that in a way that's reasonable with respect to prior art.
Yeah, John, the only request is there is a possibility that we might want to add a host name. So let's just make sure that we don't lock it.
I'm perfectly fine adding, instead of a list of strings, a list of objects that happen to have one field, which is like name or IP or something. Like Kubernetes did that with pod IPs, for example. No problem. Extensible, simple.
Yeah.
That's fine. But let's not go add host names and arbitrary field. Like Gateway, you can not just put host names, you can put anything. So I don't want to add Costin special address type as a status entry and then Istio has to figure out what the hell that means until we have a use case for that.
So just IPv4 and IPv6 for the moment.
Yeah, I don't know if we need to have a different type for those, or you can tell which one it is by the IP, but we can bike shed that, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, that sounds good. I can probably start working on, I guess, a PR against the API repo to try and show what that would look like, if nobody has any strong objections.
How are you dealing with multi-cluster?
What type of multi-cluster?
I mean, you have service entry defined in cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3. You have the controller. Do you do master election across clusters? Do you have different IPs allocated in each cluster? And then, because I believe we watch service entries from other clusters, and
we don't watch service entries from other clusters. So how it should work is all the primaries watch one cluster, which they're already watching. They write the IPs there. If you have multi-primaries, you'll have multiple service entries and they'll get different IPs potentially, which is the same as service logic, where a single service has multiple IPs for different clusters.
So we don't watch service entries across clusters?
No, only workload entry.
Not even the IPs? I remember at some point we did.
No, it's only workload entry.
Okay.
Yeah, if we do change that, then potentially we'd want to change this as well, but currently we do not. So.
For me, it's a problem because with external DNS, obviously, you don't want, since it's a FQDN, it's not ideal to create 10 different IP addresses, one for each cluster, and but okay, that's
And that's what Kubernetes does with service, right, Custom? Right, each cluster.
not with cluster set, and our use is closer to cluster set where you want a VIP that is common. And I mean, what we do for service, it's.
Are you sure that cluster set has a different IP or the same IP?
Cluster set is create an entry in DNS, and it's one VIP
because I haven't looked in years, so this was a long time ago, but I recall that some of the implementations were creating a service per cluster set and to get an IP. But maybe they only do that in one cluster set. Anyhow.
Okay, some implementation may. I completely agree. I don't know how. It's not. I don't think it's specified how you do it.
Okay.
But at least
and I would think like some implementation of Istios, like there's no requirement that the IPs are different across clusters. Obviously, there's just no requirement they are. So if you had a centralized controller, you could assign the same IP, or if you don't, then you could just have, I don't know, external DNS watch one cluster. I don't know. You'd have to think about that case a bit more, I think.
Yeah, one request from a customer was to, and I think there is some other open source project to replicate the service entries across camp. So you have a config cluster where you define the service entries, and then you can replicate them in others. So that's another option.
Doesn't maybe misunderstood, but wouldn't the requirement to make these IP be the same for service import or service in general break multi-network, where you don't have a flat network?
I mean, these are VIPs, so they don't really matter. You could put literally anything into VIP. Right? It's only the IP is only relevant between the application and the sidecar or the Z channel. It never actually leaves the node, which is why auto allocation works. We stick a reserved IP range there.
That's true. God.
Now, I mean, if you were to conflict with like Google's IP address, then you'd have issues when they try and call Google.com, for example. That's why we use the reserved ones, but it's not quite the same as the multi-network situation.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it'd be logically the same thing as telling every cluster that their CIDR range on the same VPC was the same and letting them independently allocate, right? That would also screw shit up. But Ian, it's Costa, do you want to follow up on your point about cluster set? As far as I was aware, Kubernetes has made no attempts to reconcile IP allocation in multi-cluster. And if they have done, right, that changes things, right? That's different from DNS now, right? Not IP, like specifically talking about IP allocation.
It's related to DNS because cluster set and now actually also regular are populated, at least in Google, in Cloud DNS. And if you use Cloud DNS, obviously you want to have a single IP address on. And as you know, it's also VMs and other things that are also participating in this.
So you're trying to ensure that there's a single IP address for a multi-cluster service with an A name?
You ensure a name, a fully qualified domain name has a VIP, and that VIP is a DNS, and everyone sees the same VIP, instead of having 5 different IPs like we do for service. So service will become the exception where it has multiple VIPs, and then we have to do complicated things to know because we treat.
Okay. Is that VIP independent of the cluster's service CIDR range?
Yes.
What range is what range? So it's allocated in a different range.
Yes.
Okay, so this feature is a feature that exists outside of the cluster, not inside.
Cluster set is outside of the cluster by definition. You export to something that it's global. I mean, it's fleet-wide. Which is the case for heavy centricity. I mean, if you have a fully qualified domain name, which is not cluster local, normally that's the typical usage is not that each cluster is a different view of the world, but that it's, you know, the VPC resolver of the network can resolve it, and then it's kind of consistent across the entire mesh, not cluster-wide, clusters.
Although right now, the way you get Istio DNS, right, is to run the Istio DNS agent co-located with your workload. And because the IP is effectively virtual, you get the same logical behavior, right? So it isn't really an impediment to the implementation pattern. It's just, depending on where you are, you'll see a different IP for the same service.
It's impediment in the sense that it restricts you to only using Istio DNS. You cannot use a standard DNS resolver. You cannot use normal DNS server, which is what I'm trying to do, because only Istio DNS has its Istio-specific DNS semantics where you get different IPs that flexibly.
I just don't know if we have enough control over IP allocation. Like, we're not a VPC, Gustin, right? It's not clear that we could ever do that the way that, say, Google is doing it with cluster set and provide the same guarantees.
We are doing it at a cluster level. We have a CID array from which we allocate, and we allocate in a cluster. And
right,
we
that's
do have
because
ability to watch.
Right, because we have control within the cluster scope, and we have the ability to inject our DNS behavior into the places where we want it. I can't do that on a VPC, right, where, let's say, there's a workload that doesn't have an Istio agent installed on it, and have it reconcile. Because we can't program a VPC IP.
No,
we
no,
don't
no,
automate the
no.
allocation of like real IPs in the VPC.
That's what what I was trying to say with allocating a single IP for HTTP, all HTTP, for example, with a smart allocator. So at least from DNS perspective, everything is fine. I mean, I can show you a demo if you want. So you can populate a real DNS, any workload, even if they don't have Istio sidecar or Istio DNS, they will get the IP address. Now, if that IP address is a virtual address or if it's a real address that points to something, that's a different story. If it happens to point to something like a waypoint or load balancer, then any workload, even if they don't have a sidecar, they will be able to work perfectly fine because they will connect to that IP, and that will do for their for HTTP at least, NTLS and other things. Does it make sense? Or
No, I get what you're saying. And that's really enabling you to interoperate with things that where IPs are actually allocated. So let's say waypoints, right, which do get allocated real IPs and ingresses and egresses.
Yep.
So load balancers, like you said.
yes, if you choose to, or otherwise, again, you can use routing APIs. There are plenty of routing APIs that allows, ATP route 1, 2, 3, 4 to a different address and has the same effect.
Is there a sufficient API today to let us program DNS?
External
That's
DNS
standardized.
is not the prettiest thing as implementation, but works relatively well, and it's integrated with tons of things. It's absolutely crazy how many integrations it has. And it's super simple. I mean, it's very easy to add more stuff and to make changes. Not efficient necessarily, but I can show you a demo next time or at some point.
Okay. you want to put that on the agenda, Costin, I think that would be quite interesting.
Yeah, I'll add it.
Yeah, overall, I feel like DNS is a question we've sort of tiptoed around on a lot of occasions recently. And the frequency with which we've had to sort of tiptoe around it makes me think that maybe it's time to address that head on with a design doc and start talking about what the future direction is there. I'm not clear whether the consensus that's developing this morning is that we need to hold up this proposal for that one, or if they can proceed in parallel.
I don't think we need to hold up this proposal.
Okay.
Like
So
the behavior Costin's talking about, you would have to opt into it anyway.
Yeah. So Ian, do you have what you need to move forward?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks for the discussion.
Awesome. Well, I figure we're past the top of the hour, and I expect I'll see the rest of you in -3 minutes at the next meeting.
Yep. I had 2 links. Obviously, we don't have time to discuss, but feel free to take a look. They're just about the future of the Istio installation. No rush. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks. See you in a few.
Thanks, John.